Can I clean your mansion for a plate of food?" But when the CEO millionaire saw her, he froze. "Please, I don't want charity." Emily's voice quivered beneath the steady drum of rain pelting the stone driveway outside the Boston mansion. Lightning flashed behind the wrought iron gate as she pressed the intercom, her face buried beneath soaked strands of golden hair clinging to her forehead. "I only asked to clean your house in exchange for a plate of food for my daughter." Inside, Alexander Thorne, 37, CEO of a leading real estate firm, stared at the security monitor. His jaw clenched the moment he saw the child clinging to the woman's side. The girl wore a wooden beaded bracelet, the same kind he had once given his daughter, Lily, before the accident. His breath caught. He pressed the gate release. The iron bars groaned open. Emily stepped through, holding her daughter, Rosie. The child's small body trembled in her arms. Squaring her shoulders, Emily moved forward, eyes filled with fear and fierce resolve. When she reached the front hall, Alexander met her there. His voice was cold, precise. "What do you want?" Emily steadied herself. "Just a meal for my daughter. I'll do any work you need. Just a meal." She stood tall, drenched, but dignified. Alexander glanced down at Rosie's pale, delicate face. Thunder echoed through the chandeliers overhead. He stepped aside, voice softer now. "Come in. The child needs food." Emily led Rosie into a dim corridor, lined with classical portraits. Alexander followed silently, watching them reach a modest guest suite in the East Wing. Without saying anything more, he turned and left. Minutes later, he returned. Outside their door, he placed a small bundle, a child's sweater, trousers, and a pair of rolled-up socks. No note, just the gesture. Emily hesitated before picking them up, looking at Rosie's pale cheeks. She dressed her gently, whispering, "Eat now," then tucked her into the cot. Meanwhile, in his study upstairs, Alexander held a framed photo of Lily. Seeing Rosie wear that bracelet had shaken something loose inside him. His hands trembled. Back downstairs, Emily sat beside the bed, feeding Rosie warm broth. The child sipped slowly, eyelids fluttering. Emily wiped crumbs from her lips and wrapped her in the sweater. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure if anyone could hear. Above, Alexander returned the photo to his desk, his face unreadable but shaken. He looked out the rain-streaked window, toward the garden where Lily once played among the lilacs. The memories pressed in. Rosie murmured something in her sleep, then went quiet. Emily brushed her daughter's hair gently, then rose and stepped out into the hallway. She paused at the threshold, bowed her head slightly, and said without turning back, "Thank you for letting us stay." No reply came. Emily closed the door softly. Alexander stood on the landing above, staring down at the shut door, his hand resting on the banister. Rosie's breathing settled into the hush of the night. Emily gathered the empty bowl, careful not to wake her, and slipped quietly into the corridor. Under a faint beam of moonlight shining through the stained glass, she paused for a moment before disappearing down the hallway. The gates behind her remained open, but Emily knew she wouldn't step back into the storm. Upstairs in his study, Alexander closed his eyes and pressed the framed photo of Lily to his chest. Her laughter echoed in his memory, bright, free, and irreplaceable. Gently he placed the frame down and knelt before an old wooden chest beside his desk. Dust clung to the lid. He opened it slowly. Inside lay a beaded bracelet, identical to the one Rosie wore. He reached out, fingers brushing the worn beads, as if reaching for Lily herself. His lips moved in a fragile whisper. "Why did no one tell me she'd come back like this?" mansion was silent around him, heavy with ghosts of what had been. Alexander stood and stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the foyer below. The halls were still, yet somewhere within, Emily and Rosie slept. He closed his eyes. The rain continued against the windows, but something inside him shifted. A small fracture in his grief, a faint opening between sorrow and something almost like hope. 2 days passed since that stormy night when Emily had first stood at the gate, Rosie trembling in her arms. She had not asked to stay longer, only to work for what they received. Now Emily moved quietly through the halls, the scent of lemon polish mingling with the distant smell of rain. A rag in hand, she wiped the carved banister of the Thorne estate's grand staircase. Alexander had said little in those days, but he hadn't asked them to leave either. Nearby, Rosie played quietly with a cloth doll Emily had stitched from an old t-shirt. Though still too thin, her cheeks were no longer pale, and her wide eyes followed her mother around the room. When Alexander entered the foyer, his footsteps soft, Rosie looked up and tilted her head. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging gently at Emily's shirt. "It's the man with the sad voice." Emily turned, startled. I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "She didn't mean to be rude. She just notices things." Alexander didn't respond immediately. His expression didn't change, but his gaze lingered on Rosie longer than usual. "Children often do," he said at last, then walked past them and disappeared into the library. That night, after Rosie had drifted off to sleep in a guest bed far too big for her small frame, Emily sat nearby on a rug, mending a small tear in her daughter's jacket. The bedside lamp cast a soft glow across her golden hair as she worked in silence. A lump rose in her throat. It felt unreal, sitting in this warm mansion, safe for the first time in weeks. Only 3 weeks ago, they had still been sleeping in the rusted van behind a gas station. The engine had died during the first frost, and with no job, no savings, and no one to call, Emily had wrapped Rosie in sweaters and hummed lullabies over the sound of distant trucks. That had been the lowest point, lower than when she'd quit her nursing job after her supervisor's advances were ignored by the hospital. Lower even than the day Rosie's father walked out, slamming the door behind him without a backward glance. She hadn't cried then. But now, in this quiet house, a stranger's house, her eyes filled with something hot and unfamiliar, maybe relief, maybe guilt for feeling it. She finished the stitching and lay down beside Rosie, pulling the blanket over them both. Then she noticed something on the nightstand. A small tray sat on the nightstand, 1 cup of warm milk and 3 shortbread cookies. Rosie was fast asleep, unaware. Emily frowned. She hadn't heard anyone come in. She picked up the cup. It was still warm. A quiet kindness. She glanced toward the door. It was closed now. The next morning, Emily swept the kitchen floor while Rosie sat at the breakfast nook, coloring with a handful of worn crayons Alexander had left on the counter. Emily hadn't asked for them. She hadn't needed to. Alexander passed through briefly, gave her a quiet nod, and continued on his way, phone pressed to his ear. No questions, no lectures. Just that calm, quiet presence moving through the house like a shadow. Later, as Emily tucked Rosie in for a nap, the child whispered, "He looks at you like he's thinking about something sad." Emily smoothed the girl's curls, then sat silently in the corner, unsure how to respond. That evening, as dusk fell over the estate, Emily stood at the kitchen window, watching the last light settle across the lawn. She didn't understand why Alexander had let them stay. She didn't know what meaning he found in Rosie's bracelet, or why he'd brought milk and cookies without saying a word. She was grateful, but cautious. People with that kind of wealth rarely helped without reasons. Still, he hadn't asked her anything, not even her last name. Upstairs, Alexander sat in his study, staring into the fire. His fingers slowly traced the edges of the beaded bracelet resting on his desk, the twin of Rosie's. Laughter drifted up from the kitchen, soft and light. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, not since Lily. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, just a breath, he remembered what it felt like to come home to the sound of a child's voice. Not his child, not anymore, but maybe something close. The mansion remained quiet, the kind of silence only grief leaves behind. Heavy, unforgiving, waiting. Though grand in design, Alexander Thorne's estate felt more like a tomb than a home. Each hallway echoed with the memories of a little girl who once filled them with joy. 4 years. It had been 4 years since the accident. Alexander stood now at the threshold of the nursery upstairs, his hand resting on the frame of the door. He rarely came here. The walls were still painted soft lilac with fading murals of clouds and birds. The bookshelf sat untouched. Stuffed animals lined the bed, paused in stillness, waiting to be held. Lily had been 7, curious, gentle, with a deep love for purple orchids. She drew them constantly, on napkins, receipts, even the walls. One of those drawings, crookedly taped to the refrigerator, was still there. He could never bring himself to take it down. The day she died, Alexander had been flying to London, closing an international deal. Her mother, his ex-wife, had called him after the crash. "I thought you knew she was with me," she sobbed into the phone. He hadn't known. He hadn't said goodbye. Since that day, Alexander had buried himself in work, in expansion, in numbers and deadlines. Business made sense. Emotions did not. He'd built an empire atop that silence. It was easier, safer. But now, Rosie's voice, so much like Lily's, was slipping through the cracks. That morning, as he reviewed documents in his study, he heard small footsteps echoing softly from the floor above. Emily had been cleaning, likely tidying up the guest rooms. Alexander let her be. She was always careful, respectful, until he heard the creak of the nursery door. His pulse kicked. By the time he reached the room, Emily was standing beside the small white bed, holding a pale blue pillow in her hands. The seam had torn open, revealing a clump of loose stuffing. "What are you doing?" His voice came out sharper than he meant. Emily jumped, startled. I'm sorry," she stammered, gently setting the pillow back down. "It was torn. I was just going to mend it." "You shouldn't be in here," he said, the edge in his tone like shattered glass. She bowed her head. "I didn't know. I truly didn't mean to intrude." He said nothing. The room was already too full of ghosts. That night, after Emily and Rosie had gone to bed, Alexander returned to the nursery. The pillow was back in its place, neatly sewn. A small note rested on top. "I'm sorry for touching something sacred. I only meant to help. Emily." His fingers brushed the stitches, precise, gentle. He sat down on the floor back against the wall, the pillow in his lap, and for the first time in years, tears slipped quietly down his cheeks. Not loud, just present, like a weight he had never allowed himself to release. Downstairs, Emily paced the kitchen, uncertain if she'd overstepped. But the look in Alexander's eyes when he saw her holding that pillow hadn't been anger. It had been pain. Deep, locked-away pain. The kind that leaves no room for words. A man who had sealed grief behind a door and forgotten where he'd buried the key. The next morning, as Emily poured cereal for Rosie, Alexander appeared at the kitchen threshold. "I have more rooms that could use cleaning," he said, avoiding her eyes. "If you're willing to stay another week." Emily looked up, surprised. "Of course, thank you. It's easier having someone in the house," he added, almost to himself. "Rosie, she makes it feel like it used to." Emily nodded softly. She didn't need him to explain. Neither of them said it aloud, but something shifted in that moment. A quiet understanding, neither charity nor obligation, just the slow beginning of healing, tentative but real. The garden had long been neglected. Ivy crept lazily across the stone path, and wildflowers sprouted wherever they pleased. Once sculpted hedges had grown soft and overgrown. Alexander seldom came here anymore. It had been Lily's favorite place. Now it was just another echo. But Rosie had claimed it like it belonged to her. Each afternoon, while Emily cleaned or folded laundry, Rosie ran barefoot across the lawn, laughing at butterflies and trying to name the flowers in her sweet, muddled vocabulary. She loved the fountain, even though it hadn't worked in years. She called it the whispering water. Sometimes Emily would sit beside her, tracing little rhymes into the dirt with a stick, teaching Rosie the sounds one syllable at a time. That morning, Alexander stepped into the sunlight for the first time in weeks. He had come outside searching for air, for quiet. He wasn't sure. But instead, he found Rosie. She was standing under the old apple tree, arms reaching up toward a low branch. Her fingers barely grazed the ripest fruit. Alexander hesitated, then crossed the grass. Without a word, he picked the reddest apple and held it out to her. Rosie took it with wide, shining eyes. Then, to his surprise, she wrapped her arms around his legs and rested her head against his knee. "Thank you, Mr. Sadvoice," she said softly. Alexander froze. "Rosie," Emily's voice called from the porch, slightly breathless. Flustered, she jogged down the steps, eyes filled with apology. "I'm so sorry," she said, gently pulling Rosie back. She likes to give people names." Alexander glanced at the apple still in Rosie's small hand, then looked at Emily. "It's all right," he said. His voice was low but not cold. "She says your voice sounds like someone who lost a song," Emily added with a shy smile. "I told her some people carry quiet in their hearts." He had no reply for that. Later, they sat in the kitchen while Rosie napped upstairs. Emily peeled potatoes. For once, Alexander didn't retreat to his study. "You know," Emily said, glancing sideways, "before all this, I worked in a nursing home. Night shifts mostly. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked listening to the residents talk about the past." "What happened?" Alexander asked. Her hands paused for just a moment. "A supervisor started cornering me, saying things he shouldn't. When I reported it, they said I made it up. I walked out that day." Silence settled briefly between them. "And Rosie's father?" he asked gently. "Left when I was 3 months pregnant," she said simply. "Never called, never looked back." Alexander's jaw tightened. "That's unforgivable." Emily shrugged lightly. "I stopped trying to understand it. Rosie was born in the back seat of our old van. The first thing she did was scream, loud and strong. That sound kept me going." He watched her slice the last potato, her movements calm and steady. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. That evening, rain returned, gentler this time, like a lullaby tapping the roof. Emily and Rosie curled together on the living room sofa, wrapped in a knitted blanket. The fire crackled gently. Rosie's small body was tucked against her mother's, Emily's arm protectively around her. Alexander came downstairs for a glass of water, but paused when he saw them. He didn't step closer. He just stood quietly in the hallway, watching. the gentle rise and fall of their breathing. Rosie's tiny hand clutching a fold of Emily's shirt. Emily's face, even in sleep, ready to wake at the smallest sound. He stayed there for a long while. Then he quietly turned off the hallway light so it wouldn't disturb them and walked back upstairs. He could feel it, that slow, delicate warmth he hadn't allowed in years. He was starting to care again. But caring was dangerous, and the last time he'd loved without walls, it had destroyed him. Still, as he lay in bed, the image of Emily and Rosie stayed with him. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, sleep didn't come as an escape, but as a place where their laughter followed him into dreams. The storm came without warning. By early evening, the sky had turned the color of iron, and the rain fell in heavy sheets, hammering the tall windows of the Thorne estate. Thunder growled low in the distance. Inside, the house glowed warmly, until it didn't. At exactly 7:08 p.m., the entire estate went dark. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The security lights cut out. Silence fell, broken only by Rosie's small gasp upstairs. Emily stood in the kitchen holding a flashlight. "Well?" she said, her voice calm, though her heart beat faster. "Looks like it's going to be a candlelight kind of evening." Rosie clapped her hands like it was a camping trip. Within minutes, Emily had arranged a few candles on the coffee table. Their soft flames flickered against the glass, casting golden light across the living room walls. Emily wrapped Rosie in a blanket and sat with her on the rug. Alexander appeared a moment later, uncertain, holding a thick book of poems in one hand. He paused at the doorway. "Come on," Emily said, patting the floor beside her. "We don't bite." Alexander chuckled and sat down, a bit stiff at first. The candlelight softened his features, easing the harsh lines that usually shaped his face. "Tell us a story, Mommy," Rosie chirped. Emily leaned back, her smile playful. "Okay. Once upon a time, there was a tiny hedgehog who wanted to fly." As the story unfolded with wild exaggerations and silly voices, Rosie laughed uncontrollably, her giggles bouncing off every corner of the room. She rolled to her side, howling with delight when Emily imitated the hedgehog trying to build wings from leaves and string. Alexander watched, stunned. It wasn't the sound of laughter that undid him. It was the shape of it. The way Rosie's nose scrunched, the tiny gasp between giggles. It was exactly how Lily used to laugh. His hands began to tremble. Emily finished the story, laughing too, then turned and noticed him. Her smile faded. "Are you okay?" Alexander blinked. He hadn't realized the tears had come until one slid down his cheek. He looked away quickly, his voice breaking. "I haven't heard that sound in 4 years." Emily didn't speak. She just waited. "My daughter," he said at last. "Her name was Lily. She was 5. She died in a car accident. I was away, across the country, in a meeting. I wasn't there." Emily's eyes softened. "I'm so sorry." "I've tried," he said, voice hollow. "Tried to forget, to bury it, to work enough that it would stop hurting. But sometimes I see Rosie, and it feels like I'm drowning all over again." Emily shifted closer, not touching, but near enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Do you think," she asked gently, "that pain ever really leaves? Or does it just need someone willing to carry a piece of it with you?" Alexander looked at her then, really looked, and in the flicker of candlelight, he didn't see a struggling mother or a guest in his home. He saw a woman who had known pain and still chose love. They sat quietly, the only sound the soft rhythm of rain against the windows. Later, Emily drifted off to sleep on the couch, Rosie curled beside her. Alexander stood and gently placed a wool blanket over her shoulders. His hand lingered briefly, then withdrew. He looked down at them. A family, though none of them had meant it that way. He stepped back into the hallway shadows, but the warmth in his chest didn't leave. It stayed, stubborn, unfamiliar. He didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in years, he didn't fear his dreams. The piece shattered with a single headline. It started on a gossip blog. Cheap font, grainy photos, and a cruel title. Billionaire CEO playing house with homeless maid. By morning, the story had exploded. Reporters crowded outside the Thorne Estate's front gates, swarming like bees. Emily stood behind the living room curtains, horrified, microphones shoved through the bars. Flashbulbs burst like lightning. Is it true she was living in a van? Did she trap you, Mr. Thorne? Is the child yours? Rosie whimpered at the chaos. Emily held her close, shielding her with trembling arms. Then Alexander stepped outside, calm but furious. He faced the cameras and spoke with quiet strength. This woman, he said, voice steady, is the reason my daughter smiles again. She is the reason I remember how to breathe. His eyes swept across the crowd. And if any of you ever call her a gold digger again, Alexander's voice rang out, you'll be hearing from my lawyers. The reporters froze. Emily sat stunned. She hadn't expected such a fierce public defense. That afternoon, James Mallory, Alexander's oldest friend and the only one who'd stayed in touch, turned up unannounced. Striding through the kitchen as if he owned the place, he stopped before Alexander and raised an eyebrow. You look different, James observed. Alexander smirked. That bad? No, James replied, smiling. That alive. They settled in the study, fire crackling softly. James glanced at the candle on the desk, then at Lily's sketches in the open notebook. So, James said, she did it. You made it through. Alexander exhaled. I hadn't planned on any of this. I let them stay, thinking it'd be temporary. But now Rosie laughs, and I swear I hear Lily in every sound. Emily looks at me like I'm not broken, like I could be the man she believes I am. James leaned back. Then be him. Lily's gone, Alex, but you're here. You get to decide if her memory anchors you or gives you wings. Alexander stared into the flames, then slowly nodded. Later that evening, while Rosie napped and the house lay quiet again, Alexander found Emily folding laundry in the guest room. He paused in the doorway, holding something small. I wanted to give you this. He offered her a plain wooden box, intricately carved. Inside lay a thin, faded book, its title nearly rubbed away, The Adventures of Pine Cone Bunny. Lily's favorite, he said softly. She made me read it every night, even after she'd memorized every word. Emily traced the cover gently. Rosie will love it. He hesitated, searching for the right words. You remind me of her, of Lily. You love Rosie the same way I loved Lily, maybe even more. Emily looked up, warmth and uncertainty mingling in her eyes. Sometimes I wonder, she whispered, if I'm just a replacement for the life you lost. Alexander's expression softened. You're not. He didn't say more. His gratitude, admiration, and fragile hope shone in his eyes. As Emily closed the box, their hands brushed. Brief, but everything between them shifted. She offered him a small, hesitant smile. Outside, the last reporters had gone. The estate was quiet, but inside its walls, something new had begun to blossom. Not yet declared, but growing nonetheless. The sun filtered through the old willow's branches, casting dappled shadows on the manicured lawn. A checkered picnic blanket lay beneath a broad oak, strewn with sandwich crumbs and bright plastic cups. Rosie's laughter rang out as she chased bubbles across the grass, wobbling on her tiny feet. Emily sat barefoot on the blanket, her hair catching the afternoon light as she sipped lemonade and watched her daughter. A few feet away, Alexander sat cross-legged, observing them both. He'd never cared for picnics. They felt staged, like photo ops. But this felt real. The breeze, the laughter, the gentle chaos of a toddler and two people learning what it meant to be together. His chest felt warm and heavy all at once. "Careful, Rosie," Emily called as the girl darted toward the stone path. But the warning came just a moment too late. Rosie tripped at the edge of the garden path, falling with a sharp cry. Her small hands scraped against the stone. Emily jumped to her feet, heart pounding. But Alexander was quicker. He was already there, scooping the sobbing child into his arms with practiced care. "Hey, it's okay, sweetheart. I've got you," he murmured, brushing the dirt gently from her knees. Then it happened. Through her tears, Rosie clung to his shirt and cried out, "Daddy!" Time stopped. Alexander froze, his heart thudding in his chest. Emily, halfway across the lawn, stopped in her tracks. Rosie buried her face into his neck, still sniffling. Slowly, Alexander sank to his knees on the grass, holding her close. His arms wrapped around her instinctively, protectively, and then the tears came. He didn't sob. He simply held her and wept, quietly, the sound of her small voice echoing through every empty corner inside him. Emily knelt beside them, eyes shining. "She's never called anyone that before," she whispered. Alexander looked up, his voice low. "I didn't expect it to feel like this." Emily gently placed a hand on his arm. "Do you want to be a part of our lives?" she asked softly. "Not to fix the past, but to build a future?" He didn't hesitate. "I do." Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual rhythm, Emily found a single flower on the dining table, a purple orchid, Lily's favorite. No note, no explanation, but she knew it was a promise. From the doorway, Alexander watched her discover it. He said nothing, only met her gaze. She smiled, touched the petals, and looked back at him with quiet understanding. That night, after Rosie had fallen asleep with her stuffed bunny curled under her arm, Alexander and Emily sat together in the living room. The fireplace glowed low. Alexander reached across the space and took her hand. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Ever." Emily exhaled, her breath filled with both relief and hesitation. "And what happens when people start asking questions? When the press wants to know who I am to you?" Alexander looked into her eyes, unguarded. "They'll know you're the woman I trust, the one who saved my life." He paused. "And if it takes time to share the rest, that's okay too." Emily nodded. "Then we stay, for now." He smiled. "For always, if you'll have it." Outside, the garden glowed with the last light of day. Inside, in the quiet space between grief and healing, something beautiful had begun. A family, not bound by blood, but by love. The Thorne estate no longer felt like a fortress. Over the months, it had softened. Where silence once echoed, now came laughter in the mornings, music in the kitchen, and tiny footsteps down the hall. Emily stood at the front door, tying her shoes, a stack of textbooks under one arm. Her blonde hair was pulled into a neat bun. "Orientation starts at 10, she said, voice tinged with nerves. "You'll be brilliant," Alexander replied, sipping coffee from the doorway. "They're lucky to have you." She smiled, kissed his cheek, and stepped outside. Rosie came running after her, backpack bouncing. "Mama, you forgot your lucky pen." Emily laughed, scooping her up and spinning her in the air. Alexander watched from the porch, his heart full. Just months ago, this life seemed impossible. Emily's dream of nursing, Rosie's bright, fearless joy. And now, here they were, stitching together a new beginning. Inside, the living room had changed too. Gone were the stiff furnishings and cold corners. Now there was a play tent in the corner, a shelf of children's books, and on the center wall, a new painting. Rosies, crayon and watercolor on thick paper. 3 figures holding hands under a crooked sun. One tall, one in a dress, and one small with curly hair. At the top, in bold letters, family. Alexander had framed it himself. When Emily saw it, she stood still for a long moment, then gently brushed her hand against his. "Thank you," she whispered. One rainy afternoon, they sat together in the garden under a patio umbrella, the soft drizzle surrounding them. Rosie danced barefoot on the wet stones, laughing as raindrops kissed her cheeks. Alexander leaned over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "I used to hate the rain," he murmured. She looked at him. "And now?" He watched Rosie spin, arms out like wings. "Now it feels like a second chance." Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "I used to live afraid of goodbyes, but now I believe in tomorrows again." They sat together, letting the rain wash gently over their thoughts. That evening after dinner, Rosie crawled onto Alexander's lap, cradling a photo album Emily had picked up from a thrift store. "Tell me again," she said, pointing to a picture. Alexander smiled. "That was your first trip to the zoo. You fed the goats and screamed when one licked your hand." Rosie giggled and buried her face in his chest. "You're the best, Daddy." He held her close, eyes closing. "I had the best teacher," he whispered. That night, after Rosie was asleep, Alexander walked through the garden alone. The flowers Emily had planted now bloomed freely. Among them, a small patch of purple orchids. He knelt beside them, his fingers grazing the petals. "Hi, Lily," he whispered. "I hope you like the garden." He stood, a little lighter than the day before. When he returned inside, Emily stood barefoot by the door, glowing in the candlelight. She reached out, took his hand. "We're home now, aren't we?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, we finally are." And beneath the gentle hum of rain and quiet hope, they stepped into the warmth of their new life. Pain never disappears, the story seemed to whisper, but it softens when held by hands that choose love over fear. If this story moved you, if you felt the quiet ache of loss, the beauty of second chances, and the healing power of unexpected love, then we invite you to stay with us at Soul-Stirring Stories. Each week we share tales that speak to the heart, stories of resilience, redemption, and the quiet magic of human connection. If you believe in love that heals, in families made by choice, and in moments that stay with you, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful language needs no words, just a heart willing to listen. See you in the next story.